On a crowded flight, a millionaire's autistic son screamed uncontrollably, passengers grew restless, the father panicked, and the flight attendants couldn't calm him. Just when frustration filled the cabin, a poor black boy quietly stepped forward, and what happened next left the entire plane in stunned silence. The flight from New York to Los Angeles was supposed to be peaceful, or at least that's what passengers had hoped for when they boarded that afternoon. The air smelled faintly of coffee and leather seats, overhead bins clicked shut, and tired travelers settled in for a cross-country journey. Among the passengers sat Richard Hale, a millionaire known in business circles for his steel empire, but on this flight he wasn't a CEO, he was simply a worried father. Beside him was his 10-year-old son, Daniel, a boy with wide innocent eyes who lived with autism. For Richard, every public journey was a gamble. Would Daniel be calm, or would the unfamiliar noise and cramped spaces overwhelm him? As soon as the plane took off and the engines roared, Daniel began rocking in his seat, his hands pressed tightly against his ears. The sound was too much. He let out a loud scream that pierced through the cabin like a siren. Heads turned sharply. A baby began crying in response. Flight attendants rushed over, trying to soothe the child with juice and soft words, but Daniel's screams only grew louder. Richard's expensive suit did nothing to hide his helplessness, sweat collected at his temples as he whispered, "It's okay, son, it's okay." But his words had no effect. Passengers started mumbling. "Can't they control him?" someone hissed from the back. Another muttered, "This is going to be a nightmare flight." The pressure weighed heavily on Richard's shoulders. He wished he could explain to everyone that Daniel wasn't spoiled or misbehaving. His brain processed the world differently, sounds felt like thunder, lights felt like fire. But explanations didn't calm the judgmental stares. Richard held his trembling son and silently prayed for relief. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Daniel's cries grew raw, his body shaking, tears streaking his cheeks. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, whispering about whether they needed to ask Richard to deplane at the next emergency stop. Passengers were growing restless. A businessman pulled his laptop back with irritation, muttering about missing work. A young mother tried covering her toddler's ears. Someone loudly demanded a refund. Richard felt his chest tighten with shame and frustration. All his millions couldn't buy peace for his child, couldn't silence the cruel comments, couldn't shield Daniel from the world's impatience. He pressed his forehead against his son's hair, whispering, "Daddy's here, buddy, Daddy's here," but Daniel screamed even louder, overwhelmed by the roar of the engines. The tension in the cabin became unbearable, until an unexpected voice broke through. From a few rows back, a young boy, perhaps 11 or 12, with patched clothes and worn sneakers, stood hesitantly. He was traveling alone, clutching a small backpack with frayed zippers. His skin was dark, his hair cut close, his eyes carrying the tired wisdom of someone who hadn't lived an easy life. Passengers glanced at him, some confused, some annoyed. What could this poor kid possibly do in such a situation? But the boy took a step closer to Daniel, ignoring the murmurs. "Can I try something?" he asked softly, his voice steady despite the tension. Richard looked up, startled. The boy's gaze was gentle, not judgmental like the others. In that moment, Richard, desperate and exhausted, simply nodded. The boy knelt down in the aisle, face to face with Daniel, and then he began to hum. At first, the sound was barely audible, a soft, low tune that slipped into the air like a whisper. The boy hummed a lullaby, not polished or professional, but raw, heartfelt, and warm. Daniel's screaming slowed, his head turning slightly toward the sound. The boy continued, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face, his voice steady and kind. Passengers grew quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the flight attendants froze in place, watching in disbelief. The boy began to sing actual words, a simple gospel tune his grandmother used to hum while rocking him to sleep in a creaky wooden chair. The lyrics spoke of peace, of comfort, of being safe in the storm. The vibration of his voice, deep and soothing, seemed to wrap around Daniel like a blanket. Daniel's breathing slowed. His hands lowered from his ears. The tears stopped. Slowly, he leaned closer, almost pressing his forehead against the boy's shoulder. The cabin was silent, the only sound the poor boy's song floating through recycled air. People exchanged stunned looks. The businessman who had complained earlier now sat frozen, his eyes glistening with something unfamiliar. The young mother smiled, hugging her child tighter. Even the grumpy passenger in the back leaned forward, captivated. Richard stared in awe as his son, usually inconsolable during sensory overload, calmed down completely. Daniel's body went limp with exhaustion, his tiny hand clutching the boy's sleeve as if it were a lifeline. The millionaire's throat tightened. In all his wealth and influence, he had never witnessed a miracle like this. It didn't come from doctors or therapies or money. It came from a poor boy's heart. For the rest of the flight, Daniel stayed calm, resting peacefully beside the boy, who sat quietly humming whenever turbulence or noise threatened to stir him again. The cabin atmosphere transformed from frustration to quiet respect. Passengers who had rolled their eyes earlier now offered the boy snacks, water, even a blanket. The flight attendants praised him with genuine admiration. Richard sat in silence, overwhelmed with gratitude. When the plane finally landed in Los Angeles, passengers didn't rush to disembark as usual. Instead, they waited, watching the unusual friendship between a millionaire's autistic son and a poor black boy who had saved the day. As they stood to leave, Richard approached the boy, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Son," Richard said, voice thick with emotion, "you don't know what you just did for me. For my boy. For everyone on this plane. You gave him peace when no one else could." The boy lowered his gaze shyly. "My grandma used to sing to me when I was scared," he said. "I thought maybe it could help him too." Richard swallowed hard. He wanted to ask about the boy's family, his story, his struggles, everything about him radiated resilience. But before he could say more, the boy picked up his small worn backpack. He didn't expect thanks, didn't ask for reward. He was simply being himself. Richard stopped him, pressing a business card into his hand. "If you ever need anything, you call me. I mean it, anything." The boy nodded, pocketing the card without a word. As Richard watched him disappear into the crowd, he realized the greatest wealth in the world wasn't measured in dollars, but in moments of kindness, in the ability to bring peace where none existed. That day, a millionaire learned from a poor boy what money could never teach, the pure, unshakable power of compassion. This story reminds us that kindness doesn't need money, it only needs a heart. If this moment touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can see how compassion can change lives. And remember, sometimes the smallest act of love creates the loudest silence.